Hi, I'm Steve Wigreiser, and welcome to another edition of The Leading Question. Today I'm with Philadelphia lawyer Dennis George from the law firm of Arangio and George, and we're going to talk about business law, business transactions, probably the health of the Philadelphia economic community, and real estate. Dennis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
We described your specialty in a very broad way. Why don't you, in your own words, tell our viewers what you do?
Well, basically, we do business transactions. Anything from a real estate transaction to a small mom and pop business, or could be as large as a multifaceted dealership, a car dealership, or a corporation. But basically, that's what we do. We do business transactions.
And you do them here in the Philadelphia area?
Yes, we do it generally we do it in the Philadelphia area, in the geographic area of Philadelphia. But we can go, we've recently done a car dealership deal in Wyoming Valley, New Jersey, Delaware. But this is our area.
Okay. So, my field is personal injury litigation. And I don't have my finger on the pulse the business community in Philadelphia in the same way that you do. And you'd have to walk around with your eyes shut to not see all of the development that appears to be going on in Philadelphia. And I assume that your practice is such that you have a pretty good barometer as to the health of the Philadelphia economy. What's your take on that?
Well, I could tell you the real estate market is booming. I'm amazed. I've been practicing for over 30 years. And the last 5 years or so, real estate has just been outrageous. In all sections of the city, it's not merely Center City. It's now expanded outward from Center City. And the development and growth has been phenomenal.
And is real estate a large part of your practice?
It is. I would say 50% of our practice now is real estate.
Now, I assume that most business people, if they're going to get involved in a real estate transaction, are going to hire a lawyer, but I may be mistaken about that. Is that true?
Well, you would hope that they would, not just for the economic benefit to us lawyers, but believe it or not, there are still some business people who try and do it on their own. I recently had a scenario where that happened. A client called me after he purchased a multi-million-dollar building and ran into problems because some of the leases weren't verified. The condition of the building wasn't what was promised. So, believe it or not, there are still people out there who do transactions without attorneys.
As I understand it, the real estate world is divided up into two parts, residential and commercial. Am I right so far, or is there more to it than that?
No, basically, you can divide it into the residential aspect of real estate and the commercial aspect.
And in both aspects, there are brokers who are involved, real estate agents, professionals who list properties and assist buyers in purchasing properties?
There are. Not all the time, but sometimes.
Okay. So if I am a residential purchaser of a house and I'm already paying or will pay a broker to represent my interests, why would I hire a lawyer?
Well, first of all, most brokers earn their fee not from the purchaser, but from the seller, because the commissions come from the seller. Occasionally, a purchaser will hire a separate real estate agent, but usually the agents will split the fees. So they'll take half of the seller's fee, that would go to the seller's broker, and that would go to the purchaser's broker. But you'd also want, in my opinion, an attorney because you want to look at other aspects of it, most importantly the agreement, which drives the deal. So whatever is in that four corners of the agreement, and maybe you go back to your law school days, the statute of frauds.
Right.
Real estate has to be in writing for it to be legal. So you need to have an agreement of sale, and it starts there. That's when you want your lawyer, before you execute the agreement.
I'm assuming from time to time people come to you after the agreement is signed.
They do.
And
And I tell them, why are you coming now? It's a little late because the agreement's already signed. But you can help. You can still help. You can help them with the closing process. Sometimes you can help them with the due diligence process. You encourage them to get a home inspector, for example, so that you can review the house, see if there's anything there. Not everyone knows what is hidden, for example, or what could be damaged in a home.
now you are a self-described transactional lawyer.
That's correct.
And I would add the word business, so that may be redundant. Business transactions.
Yes, yeah, that's fair.
So I throw the term around like I understand what it is. Why don't you just tell us what that means?
Well, a transaction, you and I want to do a deal. Let's say you want to acquire a company or a piece of a company. I will be there to help you through that transaction. So there will be a buyer, a seller. You need me to represent you if you're looking to acquire something, and it could be anything from a company that sells widgets to real estate purchase to law firms. We've been utilized in transactions for partners who want to get involved in law firms or have a partnership agreement.
What kinds of things do you, as a business lawyer, look for in a potential transaction or deal between two parties?
I guess the first thing you want to make sure is your client wants to do the deal and it makes sense. So I work in conjunction on business transactions, especially if they're substantial, with accounting firms to make sure they do the due diligence, which is probably the most important aspect of any transaction, is your due diligence.
What is that exactly?
That could be anything from looking at the books of the company, the records of the company, the physical aspect of the building, the environmental aspect of a real estate property. So there's a whole host of things you can utilize in your due diligence process. And most, for example, in a real estate deal, what we always incorporate or try to is have a period of time in which the buyer, if it's the buyer, has a due diligence period, an inspection period. And you can kick the tires, so to speak, and make sure that you're buying what you think you are buying and that it's worth the price you're paying.
We hear the term real estate developer a lot. And when some of us hear that term, we think about 20 or 30-story apartment buildings or condominiums and large projects that you see as you walk the streets of Philadelphia. Is there such a thing as a smaller real estate developer?
Oh, sure. Can
you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, recently we represented an individual. She acquired a tract of land and built 6 units. So it would be, we did the condominium documents, so she built the units and then sold off each of the units to purchasers. So not every real estate developer does a multi-floor, multifaceted commercial mixed-use project. Some of them simply do houses and then build them and flip them and try and, build the next one.
So if one of our viewers, for example, has a parcel of land or an existing building or structure and wants to turn that into either a commercial property, perhaps a rental property, or if it's a larger unit, perhaps wants to subdivide it into smaller units. Take us through that process, and if you wouldn't mind, as long as we have you here,
Okay.
could you give some advice to people thinking about it? Perhaps somebody inherits a property, or they made a very good decision a long time ago to buy a piece of property that is suddenly worth much more, potentially, or worth much more if properly developed. Take us through that process.
Well, if the first thing is you have to know what you're doing. You just can't become a developer. And that's been a pitfall of a lot of individuals in the city, because you just can't build a house. You have to have your construction team ready. You have to have your architect online. The zoning has to be ready. So let's say you have a piece of land. The first thing you have to ascertain is what's it zoned for. Because you just can't put a commercial building in a residential zoning district. So if you want to convert to a commercial, you would probably go, the process would be, you'd go and hire an architect. The architect would then develop a plan for you, and then you'd have to see if it's zoned properly. If it's not zoned properly, you'd have to make an application to the Zoning Board of Adjustment to get it rezoned if you're looking to convert it from residential to commercial, which then takes you through a whole process. So it's not merely, if I was advising someone who didn't have the experience, I'd say maximize your price and sell it.
Because there's a lot involved.
There's a lot involved, but it's if you're looking to do it and you have some experience in doing it, or you think you'd like to do it, then there is a step process. The first step would be, again, you go back to the due diligence. What's it zoned? What's it worth? Can you get lending for it? Because don't forget, most people are not going to build it with cash. They're going to have to go to a bank and get a loan, a construction loan or a development loan, and then go through that process. And as counsel, you can help them through all of those processes,
Right.
from the zoning to the lending to the final sale.
So we got zoning, we have financing, we need a contractor, a general contractor, we may need subcontractors, we need an architect. If somebody, for whatever reason, maybe they have some extra time, maybe they're at or near retirement age and they want to take a run at this. If they came to you,
Yes.
do you have names of architects, names of contractors? Do you have the ability to look at the zoning? I mean, is this the kind of thing, and I know you've suggested to individuals that perhaps they maximize the price and sell it, but could you take somebody through that?
Yes, what we would do is, if they don't have an architect, we would provide them a list of architects we've worked in the past with. We could provide them with other contractors, but I'd prefer the architect refer the contractors than we do. We could certainly, developers come to me all the time, individuals come to me all the time to do land use work, which is the zoning work.
Right.
So yes, I can help them with the architect. I work in conjunction with the architects, the accountants, to work them through the process.
And I assume that an accountant can advise somebody as to whether this even makes sense, because the property has a value to begin with. You got to add value, which obviously costs money. There's financing costs. And then at the end of the day, either your rental income has to make sense relative to your investment, or if you're going to flip it, as you say, you got to have a pretty good idea that you're going to make money. Otherwise, it was all for naught.
That's correct. And we would also help them with the legal structure. You don't want to necessarily put it in your individual name, so we would maybe form a limited liability company or a corporation so that you have liability protection, because we don't want guys like you coming and suing us if something goes wrong.
Well, if everything is done properly, you don't
That's
have to
right.
worry about me.
That's right.
But if it's not, that's a different story.
That's correct.
Right, so it sounds like you give counsel to small businesses as well as large businesses.
We do.
So how does that work? And I'm not going to ask you for your fees. I don't want to know about that at this point. But is there a way to tailor your fee structure so that it makes sense for a small business person as opposed to a large corporation?
Yeah, well, usually a small business will not take up the time we would need. For example, if we're doing a transaction that's 10, 20, 30 million dollars, that would obviously take an enormous, much more time than it would for a simple single-family home transaction. So it's driven by our hourly fees, but proportionally, it always makes sense. So that if you're buying a single-family home, we're not going to spend as much time, for example, as we would if you were acquiring a shopping center. So it usually works out that way, where the fees will be substantially less, obviously, because there's a lot less work that has to be done.
Right. And I always advise individuals that when they walk into a lawyer's office, I don't care what the area of law is, one of the first things that you should ask about are the fees. And I also suggest that they ask the question about what the potential projection of fees will be. Is that a reasonable question
It's a
for
very
the client to
reasonable,
ask?
absolutely. It's a very reasonable question, and we prepare an engagement letter which dictates what the fees are on an hourly basis for all of our lawyers who work in our firm. And it's a very reasonable question to ask, what's the projected fee? What do you anticipate it to be? And that will vary depending on, for example, let's go back to zoning. I always tell them in a zoning transaction, because in Philadelphia, for example, we have what's called registered community organizations. You have to go to the registered community organization now to get zoning approval. Sometimes that meeting could be 1 hour, and then sometimes it could be 4 or 5 meetings to get what you need. So therefore, the hourly fee is going to be driven by how many meetings you have to attend, what you have to do for those items. So maybe it's only 1 hour's worth of work versus 5 or 10 hours worth of work. So there's going to be some flexibility in the projection as well.
Well, I was going to ask you about community groups because anytime you hear about larger developments, you hear about things like zoning. You hear about things like historic commissions. You hear about community groups, and frequently there is opposition to at least some of the larger projects. And I wanted to get your take on the role of community groups. It sounds like the city is divided up into registered community groups, if I heard you correctly.
It really has, the community groups have grown substantially in the influence they have over the zoning process. Now, in some ways, it's really good because some of the developers have abused the areas. And in other ways, sometimes you get requests that are somewhat bizarre. They don't like a particular color, or so you have to deal with that. But generally, I think if you have a community group, they're trying to protect their neighborhood. So, for example, in Old City, it makes sense to me to have the historical commission involved because you want to keep the flavor of the community as it is. I mean, we all love going down there, seeing the Old City the way it is.
Sure.
So the windows have to match. They don't want you putting in, windows that don't make sense, and the brick has to match. So those things, I think, are beneficial to the city. So in a lot of ways, the developers sometimes cross the line, and these community groups keep them in line.
So I assume when you're contemplating a project, one of the first things you want to do is some outreach to somebody, if not the community group directly, to get a feel for what the reaction of the community group may be to the project.
You could do that, yes. Generally, what we tend to do is, I try to do that whenever you could. It's not always easy because sometimes the community groups won't entertain you until you actually file a zoning application.
Right.
So on big projects, yes, you're going to go to the community early and say, this is what we have, and get a feel for what the resistance would be or whether they would be in favor of it. So yes, that's a good point.
I am not quoting from or citing the title of any particular book when I ask you this next question, but the term "the art of the deal." To me, the issue in my mind is there any room for creativity or out-of-the-box thinking when you are contemplating or advising on business transactions?
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's, I'm not in favor of the art of the deal, but creativity is essential, I think, in any business transaction. Sometimes you overcome hurdles, especially with counsel on the other side or sellers or buyers, by being creative. I mean, it could be as simple as, we don't need a particular document if you can show us that that's the case. We're doing a shopping center in Allentown, and they want to subdivide the land. Well, the subdivision isn't complete yet. So we decided we'll do a drawing and make it this is what we propose, and approximately this is, and we'll finalize it later. But to overcome the problem right now, we'll do things to make it work. So, oh, absolutely. I love to be creative in deals. I think that's the fun of the deal.
And there's room for that. It's not all form driven.
Oh, no, no, I don't think there is. I mean, most of the time, you're going to want what you want, your representations, your warranties, you need those. But sometimes the creativity comes in the negotiation process. That's when it really can be creative.
All right. Now, you use two terms that I am familiar with, but I want to make sure our viewers are up to speed. You talked about the importance of representations and warranties.
Yes.
What are they, and why are they important, and why do our viewers need to worry about
Well,
them?
in a residential scenario, let's take them separate. In a residential scenario, your warranty can be simply something like you warrant that the heater works, that the water heater's working, the air conditioning units work, etc. In a commercial transaction, your representations and warranties could be there are no violations against the property. There's no environmental damage on the property that the seller is aware of, that the seller has the authority to sell it. You know, you have to be careful when you're buying something that the seller is really the seller. Recently in Philadelphia, we went through a whole host of, and I think it was in the paper again recently, where there are decedents who left real estate to their heirs, and then con artists, for lack of a better term, come in and actually draft deeds and recorded the deeds in the city of Philadelphia and then sold them. And then the buyers found out that they really didn't own the property that they acquired.
Who, just if we can skip it, who gets stuck in that situation?
The buyer, unless, and this is critical, if one advice I will give to your viewers, get title insurance. Whatever you do in any real estate transaction, make sure you acquire title insurance, because that will protect you against, you will have insurance for ownership and no liens or encumbrances against the properties.
So in that example, if I bought a property from an individual who was acting in an unscrupulous way and I didn't know it,
Right.
And I purchased title insurance, if it turns out that he did not have authority or ownership to sell the property, would I then be able to turn to the title insurance company and get reimbursed for my purchase price?
That's exactly what you get. That's right. That's what you're buying.
Okay, so we need a lawyer and we need title insurance, and those things make sense. So if our viewers have it in their mind that they want to start a business, it could be a coffee shop, it could be a laundromat, it could be a restaurant, and as you walk around Philadelphia, you see new restaurants cropping up all the time. And of course, just as frequently, you see restaurants that are closing. Take us through that process. Somebody comes into you. They've dreamed about starting a coffee shop or a cafe or a restaurant. How do you go about advising them?
Okay, so what we would do, first we'd ascertain whether or not they own the real estate themselves or they're looking to lease the real estate. And that's critical, because what you want to do if you own the real estate and you want to start a business, we always recommend that the real estate be held in a separate entity from the actual business itself.
Why is that?
Because you want to separate your liability. If the business fails, you don't want it under the same entity so that they can then say that the real estate may have value, separate value from the business itself. So you always want to separate your real estate holding from your business holding.
So if you are leasing
Yes.
the property, which is, I assume, more common than a property owner coming in wanting to start a business, and the business goes south, the coffee shop goes south, that entity would have liability under the lease for rental payments.
That's right.
And if that entity is a separate entity than the entity that owns the land, and you've complied with all the corporate formalities and there's no reason to set that aside, then you're not going to lose your land.
That's correct.
Now, as a smart landlord with a startup coffee shop, for example, wouldn't I want something more than the signature of a startup corporation?
Yes, as a landlord, for example, you would want the personal guarantee of that individual. So you're correct. It depends on which side of the aisle we're on. If I'm representing a landlord and something like that occurs, you're going to have a startup business. They have no experience. If you have someone like Wawa, you're not worried about it.
Right.
You know you're going to get paid. If you have a startup company, if I'm representing the landlord, you always want to have personal guarantee of the individual because they have no experience. They have no business history that we can look upon to evaluate whether it's a worthy tenant from an economic standpoint. If you're from the tenant side, obviously you want to avoid personal liability whenever you could. I would always recommend, though, in a business that we started up either in a corporate setting, which is you incorporate the business, or now I've been using more and more limited liability companies because they're a little more flexible. It's the same corporate protection from a liability standpoint. You just have a little more flexibility. It's treated as a partnership for tax purposes if there's more than one person. So if a person's coming in and wanting to start a business, the first thing you want to do is get them in a corporate structure and then make sure they have a good accountant, or at least have an accountant that they can advise them on the tax aspect of it. And then they have to know the business. I mean, the pitfalls of a restaurant business are substantial. You can be successful one week and down the drain the other. And with a restaurant, there's other aspects of it. You have to consider acquiring a liquor license, which is important, or maybe not. There's a lot of BYOBs, bring your own bottle. But there's a lot of aspects of developing or starting up a business. The first of which is start it from a corporate standpoint, see who your partners are, and as much as possible, limit your personal liability.
So is that the reason that you advise that everybody incorporate or adopt a limited liability format?
Yes, exactly. Which is another form of incorporating. Yes, because if nothing else, you're gonna have insurance. You're gonna have all the things that you need. You have to go out and acquire insurance, and so that at least you're protected from your personal assets, your home, your savings. Personally, is separate from your business.
Right. I like the term one-stop shopping. I always have, and we talked about it in the context of development of property. But if I were to come to you and tell you, despite all the odds, I'm determined to start a restaurant,
Okay.
but I don't have a reliable accountant. I don't have suppliers, vendors, whatever else I may need. I don't know where the restaurant should be located. Do you connect people with professionals who can give people advice?
We can help to a certain degree, yes. But I'm adverse in the sense of I don't necessarily recommend that you buy your food from this supplier. We can help with, we have a host of accountants we work with. We just give them the list and say, call them up, see what you feel. It's like a lawyer. You come in. What I like to do is I like to meet my clients. A lot of people, it's a lot through the email or websites. Pick up the phone, give me a call, come in. Generally, the first meeting, there's no charge. We want to meet you and see if it's a good fit. But to a certain extent, yes, I have people that we represent in the business, and I would be happy to say, hey, give Mr. So-and-so a call. Maybe he can help you out with that.
So, are there occasions when you tell the client or the prospective client, I recognize that it's your dream, but in my opinion, this is not likely to be a successful venture? Have you ever said that?
Probably I have. You never want to ruin anyone's dream, but what we would do is at least let them know what they're facing and the possible losses that they could be looking at.
Well, I feel certain you're going to be getting some phone calls, and I thank you very much for coming in today and being on the show. It's been a pleasure and very informative. And to our viewers, thank you for watching The Leading Question. We'll see you next time.